Part 5 The Enlightenment and Awakening, 1730 to 1760. Imagine you're sitting in a small coffee shop in Philadelphia in 1730. Candlelight flickering on the wooden walls and the smell of ink wafting through the air. Around you, men in simple suits and women in long dresses are passionately debating new ideas from Europe. Ideas about reason, liberty, and human rights. On the table, a freshly printed newspaper, still smelling of ink, brings news from London, Paris, and even stories from the colonies themselves. This was the period when the English colonies in North America not only grew economically and in population, but also became a crucible of ideas where the seeds of revolution and American identity began to sprout. But at the same time, a fervent religious wave was also spreading, awakening souls and dividing communities. This was the era of Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, a vibrant chapter in history where reason and faith intertwined, shaping the future of a nation yet to be born. The wind of Enlightenment swept through the colonies. In Philadelphia, a prominent figure walked the cobblestone streets. Benjamin Franklin, a man with sharp eyes and insatiable curiosity. Imagine him with disheveled hair and mischievous smile, a printer, a scientist, and a thinker all at once. Franklin embodied the spirit of Enlightenment, a movement from Europe where reason was celebrated as a torch illuminating the path of progress. He published Poor Richard's Almanac, a small book containing practical advice, witty aphorisms, and bold ideas about individual liberty. Imagine a farmer in Pennsylvania, sitting by the fireplace, reading Franklin's words. A penny saved is a penny earned. These words not only touched about money, but also ignited a spirit of self-reliance and independence. The colonies, especially in New England, became fertile ground for new ideas. Universities like Harvard and Yale, though initially founded to train ministers, now became centers for Enlightenment thought. Imagine a lecture hall at Harvard where young students debated the philosophy of John Locke, who argued that the government is legitimate only with the consent of the governed. These ideas, though still abstract, began to permeate the minds of colonial leaders, those who would soon question the power of the British Crown. In coffee houses and printing presses, the first newspapers, like the Boston Newsletter, brought information and calls for change. A reading culture began to spread, and with it, a sense of a distinct identity different from England. But the Enlightenment was not just about academic debates. It also manifested in practical innovations. Imagine Franklin with his small laboratory, experimenting with electricity and inventing the lightning rod, a device that saved thousands of lives from thunderstorms. In other colonies, inventors and merchants began building mills, forges, and even faster ships, connecting the colonies to each other and to the world. Philadelphia, Boston, and New York became bustling commercial centers, with busy harbors filled with ships. But this wealth also deepened inequality. While merchants accumulated fortunes, poor laborers and enslaved Africans remained marginalized, working on plantations or in workshops without enjoying the fruits of their labor. The Great Awakening, a spiritual wave. While Enlightenment reason spread, another movement, emotional and fervent, also swept through the colonies. The Great Awakening. Imagine a field in Massachusetts where hundreds of people gathered under the summer sky listening to a young minister named Jonathan Edwards. With a deep but powerful voice, Edwards preached, "Sinners in the hands of an angry God," describing the fragility of human life before God's judgment. Imagine the crowd, from farmers to blacksmiths, weeping, trembling, and kneeling for forgiveness. Edward's sermon was not just about religion, it awakened a sense of individuality, of a direct connection with God, challenging the authority of traditional churches. The Great Awakening was not just a religious phenomenon, it was a social revolution. Ministers like George Whitefield, a charismatic speaker from England, traveled throughout the colonies, attracting thousands to outdoor sermons. Imagine Whitefield standing on a hill in Philadelphia, his voice echoing like thunder, making even skeptics stop and listen. He called on everyone, rich and poor alike, seeking salvation through personal faith rather than relying on ministers or churches. These ideas, though religious, was very close to the spirit of the Enlightenment, individual rights and freedom of choice. This movement divided communities. In New England, traditional Puritan churches called people like Edwards and Whitefield fanatics, while their supporters, known as New Lights, believed they were reviving true faith. New denominations such as Baptists and Methodists began to emerge, attracting those who felt marginalized by the religious elites. Imagine a poor tailor in Boston feeling for the first time that he was valuable in God's eyes, regardless of social status. The Great Awakening not only stirred spirituality, it also sowed the seeds of the new idea of equality, an idea that would later become a revolutionary spark. Tensions with the outside world. While the colonies was buzzing with new ideas, the outside world was also having a strong impact. Imperial wars between England, France, and Spain drew the colonies into a spiral of conflict. Imagine a small fort on the Pennsylvania frontier where settlers and native allies prepared to confront French forces and rival tribes. King William's War 1689 to 1697 and Queen Anne's War 1702 to 1713 were the first conflicts where the English colonists fought to defend their territory against the French in Canada and their allied native tribes. These wars were not only costly in terms of lives and resources, but also made the colonists question, why should they shed blood for London's interests? Native peoples, caught between the lines of empires, had to make difficult choices. Some tribes, like the Iroquois, skillfully played a balancing act between the British and French to protect their interests. But most other tribes faced content loss, land seized, culture encroached upon, and populations declining due to disease. Imagine a Lenape village in Pennsylvania, once bustling with children's voices and traditional ceremonies, now only empty huts after a smallpox epidemic. By 1754, a larger conflict began, the French and Indian War, part of the 7 Years' War. Imagine a teenager named George Washington, young and inexperienced, leading a small army into the Ohio wilderness, inadvertently sparking a global war. This war was not just about land, it was about power between empires and the fate of North America. The English colonies from Virginia to Massachusetts provided soldiers, money, and resources, but they also began to realize that their interests did not always align with those of British Kingdom. A new identity is forming. By 1760, the English colonies had changed profoundly. The population soared, with thousands of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Scotland pouring in, bringing with them new languages, customs, and even new conflicts. Cities like Philadelphia and Boston became cultural centers, with theaters, libraries, and lively debates about politics and religion. But this development also deepened existing rifts. The elites, merchants, planters, and ministers became increasingly distant from laborers, farmers, and slaves. Meanwhile, dependence on Britain, from trade to military, began to make many feel stifled. Imagine an evening in New York tavern, where a group of merchants, farmers, and artisans gathered, debating freedom and taxes, One of them, perhaps having just read an article by Franklin, exclaimed, "Why should we send our money and blood to a kingdom thousands of miles away?" This question, though just a whisper in the dark, was a sign of a major change. The colonies were no longer just outposts of the empire. They were beginning to think of themselves as a separate entity, a nation in the making. When the moonlight illuminated the streets of Boston or the fields of Virginia, these colonies were the picture of contrast, reason and faith, freedom and slavery, unity and division. The Great Awakening stirred the soul, while the Enlightenment expanded the mind. But these ideas also sowed the seeds of discontent with Britain, with injustice, and with the very system that bound them. This was the period when the future America began to take shape, but also when big questions about power, freedom, and identity awaited answers in the rapidly changing world.